I'm Kim Conhauser-Freeman. I'm Executive Director of the Women's Foreign Policy Group, and I'm pleased to welcome you all tonight on behalf of NYU Washington, D.C. and the Women's Foreign Policy Group. It's my pleasure to invite back Angela Stent, who was actually one of my professors at Georgetown. It's a great honor to be able to host her here tonight. And we'll hear from her on her newest book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. And we're thrilled to be at NYU DC and to be joined by so many alumni, WFPG members, diplomats, one of our board members, Shaista Mahmood. Glad to have you here as well. And I'd like to thank Tom McIntyre and Polly Terzian for all their help in putting on tonight's event. At the Women's Foreign Policy Group, we believe that it's crucial to hear women's voices on all foreign policy issues, and we host numerous programs like these to highlight women leaders and amplify their voices in international affairs, as well as mentoring programs, which we partner on with NYU each year to help prepare the next generation to take on leadership. So if you're not already a member, we hope that you'll join our network and consider connecting with us to help support us in our mission. And now I'd like to turn things over to our moderator, Jill Dougherty. She's a career journalist and Russia expert. She has also served as CNN's Moscow bureau chief and correspondent and a global fellow at the Wilson Center. So she'll introduce our speaker tonight. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you so much. Boy, this is a testimony, I think, to Angela Stent to see all of the people. It's really a standing room only crowd. And you will not be disappointed, I can tell you. I am a huge fan, and I'm very sincere about this, not only because Angela Stent was also my advisor at Georgetown when I was writing my master's thesis, and I think she has written with both of the books, the most recent books, I use literally like encyclopedias when I want to kind of figure out, okay, exactly what happened at that particular point. The book, The Limits of Partnership, which was 2014, I think was that? Yeah, 2014, which deals with the United States and Russia. And then the most recent one, which I have marked up, underscored, and put little pieces of paper in, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. Both of them not only are chock full of real facts, which is sometimes very hard to find in this field, but also a really sophisticated interpretation of where Russia, Putin, the United States, vis-a-vis Russia, are going or have come from, and where they're going. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Just a little organizational point. Dr. Stent will speak for about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes or so. Then we'll sit down, we'll have a conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll be opening it up to the audience so you can think about questions as we begin this evening. I think it'll be really fascinating. Thank you, Angela. Do you want to start here or over there?
I'll stand up there. Well, I can first of all say I'm delighted to be here. I've spoken to the Women's Foreign Policy Group before, but this is my first time for the NYU group. And as a former professor of both Kim and Jill, I will take full credit for everything that they've accomplished. Admittedly, I only taught Jill when she was already a very accomplished CNN correspondent, but I, of course, have learned a lot from her in supervising her master's thesis, so I'm delighted to be here. So why did I write this book? I was basically asking three questions. So the first question was, why was the West so wrong in assuming, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that post-Soviet Russia would want to become more integrated with the West, would want to become more like the West, would want to adopt the kind of institutions and political practices that we have? And a subset of that question is, why did we assume that economic integration or greater economic integration with Russia, more trade, more economic contacts, would necessarily produce positive political results, that there was somehow this connection between global economic integration and a more positive political relationship? Secondly, how was Putin's Russia, with a GDP smaller than that of Italy, a declining population, crumbling infrastructure, an economy that's 60% dependent on oil and gas for its GDP. How is it possible for a country with those limited, if you like, it has great natural resources, but limited other resources, to reassert itself as a global player, and for Putin's Russia to return to parts of the world from which post-Soviet Russia withdrew after the Soviet collapse, and in fact, in an area like the Middle East, almost becoming the go-to power there. Quite remarkable. And a subset of that really is, and that's explains the title of the book. While relations with the West aren't good, and we know that with the United States, with Europe, there are many other countries in the world who regard Russia as a large authoritarian country with whom they can do business. And so Russia's relations with much of the rest of the world, be they authoritarian states or even some democratic states like India, are really quite good. How does one explain this discrepancy? And thirdly, and this was, of course, the hardest question to answer, how should the West interact with Russia going forward to produce at least, to have at least more productive means of engagement, not without being too optimistic about what could be accomplished? Is there a better way forward than the situation we're in now? So let me say a few words about the first question. And one's tempted to say one of the reasons we were wrong about what happened in Russia in the 1990s is because we thought that the main problem of dealing with the Soviet Union was because they were at least nominally communists. Well, it turns out that that was maybe part of the reason, but a large part of the reason was because they were Russians. And what I mean by that is not character assassination. It's the Russians have a very distinct view of their own place in the world, of their own civilization, and it really is quite different from that in the West. I go back in the book, I quote a famous 19th century Slavophile poet, Fyodor Tchutchev, who said that there can be no alliance between Russia and the West, either for the sake of interests or for the sake of principles. And then he recommended that what Russia should do was to sow division and disunity in the West. Does that sound familiar? It's quite a long time ago. And Vladimir Putin himself, I think correctly, has emphasized the uniqueness of Russian civilization, of a more communal society, one that doesn't value individualism as much as the West, and a Eurasian civilization that he would now argue is superior to that of what the Russians now call, or the Russian leadership, the decadent West, a West that has forsaken Christianity and has satanic practices. He has actually said that. And so much of what Putin has done is to define what Russia is in opposition to what the West is in the way that the Russians describe it. And so I think that's something that maybe we weren't fully aware of as we were embarking on this new relationship with post-Soviet Russia. And the other very important influence on Russia, we were just saying before, you should never give a talk about anything like this without a map, so you'll have to have the imaginary map in your head, is Russia's own sense of its place on the Eurasian landmass. So the Russian state consolidated itself by absorbing its neighboring territory. So you've never had a Russian state that didn't think about itself as gathering the lands, which is the way they described it, of their neighbors. Catherine the Great, who was a German princess who was married off at age 15 to a husband, the Russian Tsar, whom she detested. He later died under mysterious circumstances. She then became the empress, and she said, that which stops growing begins to rot. And she said, I have to expand my borders to keep my population safe. So this idea of defensive expansionism has been a very important concept historically to the Russians. And so the idea of giving up territory in perpetuity is really not something that's ever happened in Russian history. We're now at a moment where we have to see where that goes in the future. And so the Russian narrative is it was vulnerable to invasion from the north, not so much from the north, but from the west, from the east, from the south, and therefore it had to expand. If you talk to Russia's neighbors, they'll give you the exact opposite narrative. We were victims of Russian expansionism and Russian aggression. But anyway, that is certainly this idea that Russia has to have a major influence over its neighbors is a very important one. And if we thought that the Russians were going to voluntarily say, well, it's fine, Ukraine's an independent country and it'll go its own way, then I think we were sorely mistaken and we maybe didn't read enough about Russian history. Now, second question, how is Russia able to return to the world stage so effectively? So the first answer to this is that Putin had a plan. When he came into office in 2000, he was determined to reverse what he saw was the chaos, the humiliation of the 1990s, where Russia was forced to accept an agenda, as the Russians would say, forced on them by the United States and its allies, where they didn't have any agency. He wanted to restore a strong state. The Russian state was much weaker in the 1990s, and to restore Russia as a great power. And again, he wrote, on becoming president, Russia was and will remain a great power. This is preconditioned by the inseparable character of its geopolitical, economic, and cultural existence. So he had a plan. So the second reason why he was able to do this was really because the West didn't have a plan, and because Putin has been very adept at taking advantage of the distraction in the West, of division in the West, of us not paying enough attention to things, and to sort of seize opportunities. Don't forget, he's been in power 20 years. 20 years ago in August, he was made prime minister as a prelude then to becoming president. He has seen American and European leaders come and go. He's still there. Another thing that I think is important in explaining how he's been able to do this, and I have a nice article about photograph of an article from the Leningrad Evening News in 1976 in my book when Putin was 24. He's a judo champion. If you read his autobiographical essays that were published when he first became president, he explained he came from a hardscrabble childhood, his family was poor, he was an indifferent student, and the way he got out of that was by learning martial arts. And he excelled at it. He was a judo champion in 1976, and the article that I have a photograph in the book predicts that you will hear more from this man, as indeed we did. Now, you know, in judo, you can be weaker than your opponent, but if you can take advantage of their distraction, of their inattention, you can still prevail. And he's been very good at doing that. I dare say that his training as a KGB case officer has helped him with that, too. I think that explains largely how he was able to do it. So in the book, I focus on two major areas that I would say are examples of the success of Putin returning Russia as a great power. And the first one is China. We probably will talk about this more in the Q&A, but it's remarkable if you think about it. 50 years ago today, the Chinese and the Soviets were shooting at each other over the border, and the American journalist Harrison Salisbury wrote a book called War Between Russia and China Without a Question Mark. Today, they'd say that they're each other's best friend, extravagant praise. I was at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in May. They were on the stage together, and President Putin was talking rapturously about how he and President Xi had stayed up till midnight the night before, talking about so many different things, and he apologized for tiring President Xi Jinping because he realized that in China, you know, it was later, 4 hours later. But there's extravagant praise, and behind that, there is also a reality, even if you discount for some of the extravagance. And that is that China has steadfastly supported Russia since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea and the launch of a war in southeastern Ukraine. It's moved in economically, and what you see now is a strategic partnership that is increasingly focused on the military. So we had last September, a year ago, joint military maneuvers for the first time in the Russian Far East. There are military maneuvers, I think, about to begin again between the Chinese and the Russians. A few weeks ago, you had a joint Russian-Chinese bombers flying over a disputed area actually between Japan and South Korea, but anyway, harassing them. The South Koreans had to sort of not shoot back, but chase the planes out of the sky. So an increasingly assertive joint military posture. And the other thing that you have to say about these two countries is they both feel aggrieved. They believe that the West hasn't taken their interests seriously, and they both talk about a post-West world. We can argue about what they mean by that. Russia certainly is the junior partner if you look at this. It's obviously China is rising, Russia isn't, but the Russians appear to be to accept the fact that they are going to be the junior partner because of the other benefits they get from China. And of course, both of those leaders support each other in terms of their own authoritarian political systems. They're never going to criticize each other for the way they treat their own people. And the other success, I would say again, and I alluded to at the beginning, is Russia's return to the Middle East. Quite remarkable, in September of 2015, Russia basically bombed its way back into that by, it realized that Bashar al-Assad was possibly about to be defeated in the civil war, so they began a bombing campaign. Obviously, they've prevailed. He's still in power. And they forced the United States and other countries that had tried to isolate Russia after Ukraine. They forced it to deal with Russia. And today, just a couple of days ago, Jill and I were at a talk by General Joseph Dunford, the outgoing chief of the General Staff, confirming that every day American and Russian military personnel have to coordinate with each other, deconflict their air operations in Syria. So in that case, Russia chose sides. But otherwise, unlike the Soviet era, if you look at what Russia is doing in the Middle East today, it in fact hasn't chosen any other sides. In the Soviet era, you know, the Soviets favored left-leaning governments in the Middle East, no more. So Russia is the only great power that talks to all of the protagonists and antagonists on all sides of all disputes in the Middle East. And as you know, there are many of them. It has a relationship with Iran and other Shia groups, good ties to all of the major Sunni states, and really a burgeoning relationship with Israel. And in fact, two of Russia's closest new partners are two of the US's closest allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel. And of course, in the Saudi case, this has to do with the price of oil, and both of the countries agreeing to limit the output of their oil, Russia cooperating with OPEC, which it has done for a number of years now. And in the Israeli case, it has to do with the war in Syria and the fact that 1.3 million Israeli citizens hail from the former Soviet Union. So you really have Russia now as a major power there, even though it doesn't have either the military or the economic wherewithal that the United States does. It is a power there, and it has to be reckoned with. So I'll say a few words about relations with the West, which of course have deteriorated. If you look at the Russia-Europe relationship, what's very interesting is not only, of course, the deterioration of relations with the European Union since the annexation of Crimea and particularly with Poland and the Baltic states, but also the improvement of relations with some of the Central European states that couldn't wait to leave, you know, the Warsaw Pact and Moscow's tight grip after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm talking about Hungary, Bulgaria, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and a number of Central European countries that now have moved closer to Russia. We can go into the reasons for that. So the picture is very mixed. Just today, we had for the first time since 2012, 2+2 negotiations. That's the defense and foreign ministers of France and Russia met. And they both say, you know, they want things to get better, the relationship can improve. President Macron now wants to be the leader in Europe in improving ties with Russia. We'll see how that goes. But it's mixed. Germany, or the German chancellor, certainly still has a much more jaundiced view of Russia, given what it did in Ukraine and given the fact that she herself grew up in the GDR, and I think she understands Putin probably better than almost any other world leader, and she speaks his language. He speaks German, but she speaks very good Russian. And of course, the relationship with Britain has been terrible because of the poisoning of the Skripals. But still, the situation in Europe is complicated, and the Russians, as we know, have supported populist and Eurosceptical groups there. I'll say a few words about the U.S.-Russian relationship. I'm sure that we'll get into much more about that in the Q&A. It is the worst that the relationship has been since Gorbachev came to power in 1985. Russia is a toxic domestic issue, I don't have to tell you that, in a way that it hasn't been since the era of Joseph McCarthy. In other words, it's such a domestic topic now, and for people who do not like President Trump, Russia and Trump are often interchangeable, and particularly going back to the interference that Russia did in the 2016 elections and the continuing interference in our electoral system. So that's one side of it. Then, of course, we have, I would say, a very divided, dualistic policy toward Russia. We have the policy of President Trump, who still believes that he can improve ties with Russia, who's never criticized President Putin. President Putin has also never criticized him, although he criticizes the United States. He said he wants to invite Russia to come back to the G8, to the G7 again next year, allegedly in Florida. But the rest of the executive branch of government has pursued a much tougher policy toward Russia, as has the US Congress. So there is no coherent policy, but in fact, what we have in practical terms are rafts of sanctions introduced by the Congress. There are probably more to come, which the Treasury Department has largely gone along with. We can talk about how effective they've been. They certainly haven't changed Russian policy either in Ukraine or really in terms of domestic interference, but obviously there are people who believe we should go on doing that. And then the other area where we have been engaging with the Russians is the area of arms control, or let's say lack of arms control. So the United States, as you probably know, pulled out of the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces just a few months ago, actually finally in August, saying that the Russians had cheated. This is a treaty that was signed between Gorbachev and Reagan in 1987. The Russians claimed that the US was cheating. Anyway, that's gone. There's one remaining major arms control treaty left, and that is New START. It's the follow-on to a treaty that was first signed between Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev in 1972, when Nixon went to the Soviet Union at the same time that the US was mining Haiphong Harbor and still signed an agreement with the Soviets. And that controls our strategic nuclear arsenal. The Obama administration negotiated the more modern version of it. It's due to expire in 2021. It can be extended for 5 years. It can be renewed, but it's not clear that that's going to happen. It's really not clear that the Trump administration is interested in doing that, even though there are some talks ongoing with the Russians. So we're in a situation where it's possible that by 2021, or the end of it, this will be the first time, again, in 50 years, that we haven't had any agreements that regulate the nuclear arsenals of the strategic nuclear arsenals of Russia and the United States. And between us, we possess about 93% of the world's nuclear weapons. The implications of that for proliferation, I would say, are quite dire. And also this treaty provides verification, on-site verification, so that we know what the other side is doing. And if that goes away, then we really could be in for an unlimited arms race. And this is something, of course, that the Russians have been warning about for a long time. I think probably I will then just say one or two words about what can we do about all of this, and I'm sure that we will come on to that in the questions and answers. It's very difficult. I think as long as Putin is in power, he's technically or legally in power until 2024, when he's supposed to give up the presidency. We can talk about what might happen there, but at least as long as he's in power, I don't see very many chances to improve the relationship with the West. With the rest, I'm sure it will continue, those relations will develop, because Russia has really now focused so much on China and the rest of the world, and the idea that the United States and Europe are in decline, and therefore a dawn of a new era is coming, which allegedly will be led by China, Russia, India, and some of the other great powers. We obviously have to accept the fact that Russia isn't interested in being integrated with the West, and the fact that the kind of Western-style institutions that we thought might develop there aren't going to develop. That's all very clear. I think it's a mistake to pursue resets. My previous book was about that. Every time American, or I would say European leaders, think that there must be a better way of dealing with Russia, they end up being very disappointed, because it turns out that it's, until the system there changes, it's very difficult to see how that would improve. But that doesn't mean that we cannot find, a more stable way of interacting with Russia, and more regularized contacts. We really have very few high-level contacts, and haven't had for a number of years, and I think some of those have to be restored with one's eyes open, and we have to be flexible if the Russians show some signs that they are more willing to meet us on terms on which we can all agree. And I think the final thing that I always like to remind people is that the Kremlin doesn't speak for the Russian population. And to the extent that it's possible, We have to keep up our contacts and interactions with the Russian population, because, as you know, we can talk about what's been happening in Moscow recently and some of the other places where you see young people out on the streets wanting something different. We have to maintain those contacts, despite the fact it's becoming more difficult to do it. But we know that there are really no quick fixes that are coming. And so I think I'll stop there, and then we can go to questions.
Well,
First of all, Jill's questions.
well, you know, there are so many ways that we could go with this, but I'd like to begin with Ukraine, because Ukraine, I mean, most Americans know it's important, but I'm not quite sure, you know, that it's always clear why it's such a central issue. Because when you think of when the relationship really went south, was after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and then the annexation of Crimea. And all of those sanctions that the United States has, that Europe has, most of them are, you know, were at least started because of the actions by Russia. And when you think of Europe and this idea that Putin may be trying to restore the Soviet Union, it often comes back to that issue: would he take another country? Would he invade another country? So I think it's really important. And yet, you know, most of the time in the area that we both pay attention to, it's not good news. But you could say that Ukraine seems to be somewhat of a good story over the past week or so. September 7th, Russia and Ukraine exchanged prisoners, 70 prisoners, both Russian and Ukrainian, and it was considered a very hopeful sign. So is there any chance that this could lead to some type of resolution, finally, of that conflict that has taken so many lives?
I mean, that's a great question. So, on the one hand, it's wonderful news that they exchanged 70 prisoners. Then you have to ask, who were these prisoners? So the people that the Russians released, there was one famous TV movie director who they obviously picked up because they didn't like what he was saying, Alexansov. But then 24 of those people were sailors whom they'd captured when they illegally seized a Ukrainian ship in the Sea of Azov, because they're trying to control the waterways now to block the Ukrainians from exporting their goods, you know, through the waterways that technically they certainly are allowed to use. So you can say it's sort of, they took hostages. They were told by the, you know, international bodies that they had to return them, and they returned them. It's great that they returned them. So who did they get in? Who did the Ukrainians release? They mainly released people who are involved in this conflict in the Donbass in southeastern Ukraine, where the Russians, on the one hand, say we're not involved, but everybody knows they're involved. And one of the people they released, really over the objections of the Netherlands and other people, was a man called, his last name is Semach, who was apparently involved in, and has been, you can watch him, saying that he was involved in hiding the Buk missile that was used to shoot down the MH17 plane, carrying, you know, hundreds of Dutch and other people to Malaysia, actually to an HIV/AIDS conference, and where the Russians have refused to admit any culpability for it. And presumably, President Zelensky didn't have very much choice. They had to return him because apparently the Russians were holding out. So on the one hand, it's great that they released them. On the other hand, this isn't exactly an equal exchange. Will it lead to something else? We'll have to see. I mean, the hopeful people will say this is the beginning of a process, and hopefully this process will lead to more prisoner exchanges. The French and Germans have now, they're going to resume these Normandy format talks with the Ukrainians and Russians. I mean, we know there's a plan out there, which is called the Minsk Agreements, which the people are supposed to comply with. The Russians have said they're glad to see the President Zelensky is making compromises. Then you wonder what they mean by those compromises. I mean, the stumbling block, one of the stumbling blocks, is the Russians are still insisting that this area where they're supporting separatists, where the war's going on, and it's not a frozen conflict, people are still dying. They're insisting that this area have a special status that would give it a right to veto some of Kiev's, the capital's foreign policy decisions. That's unacceptable to the Ukrainians. Any Ukrainian government that did that would, I don't know how long it would last. So we'll see whether the Russians are willing to make any compromise here. President Zelensky, has come to power. He has a majority in the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada. There are many hopeful signs, but I think it's too early to say that we're on the way to resolving this.
Well, I did, in terms of Zelensky, and we all remember that Zelensky is, 41 years old. He's a reality TV star. It's a fascinating story of how he became president, but I guess people were so fed up that they were really willing to try anything. Is this a win for him? How do you, politically, what does this mean for him?
I think it is a win for him. Because he promised again that he would try and resolve this. He got these people back. Yes, I think it is a win for him. It's very interesting if you want to compare Ukraine and Russia. Go on the internet and watch the difference between the reception that the returning prisoners got in Kiev and the reception they got when they got to Moscow. So in Kiev, the president came out to greet them. He hugged them. All their families were there. It was very emotional. If you watch it, you really do get emotional. Everyone was, hugging and kissing and very happy. When the plane with the Russian prisoners landed in Moscow, they got out of the plane. There was none to greet them. Putin was nowhere to be seen. There was no official reception, nothing. So, we can argue about what that meant. Maybe if Putin had gone to meet them, it would have implied that Russia was actually involved in the war, which on the one hand they say they're not. Maybe there were other reasons, but it's quite instructive.
Yeah. And just one quick last point on our question on Ukraine. We can definitely say that Crimea is never going to be returned to Ukraine, correct?
Well, I don't think one should use the word
Never.
definitely, right? I think it would be prudent to say not for the foreseeable future, and the foreseeable future could go on a very long time.
All right. Now, on China, every time I go to Russia, I am struck by the emphasis on China. Signs in hotels, everything is in Chinese now in Russian hotels. There are street signs and things on the street at the airport. It's very interesting. And there are groups of Chinese tourists all over Moscow and also St. Petersburg. So they are best buds right now. And what I wanted to do is kind of peel away a little bit and ask you, you mentioned the joint military exercises. There was also this denominating bilateral trade not in dollars, but in yuan and in rubles. So just shorthand, but tell us, how real is this friendship? They are so unmatched, and yet they are doing things together, that, militarily and economically.
Yes. So, on the one hand, you can use the word strategic partnership. People use that for all kinds of relationships. But I think in their case, it is a strategic partnership. It's based on mutual interests. Is it based on mutual, respect? I think yes, in the part of the leaders. Mutual understanding of each other's societies? I'm not so sure about that. The de-dollarization of their trade is proceeding apace, right? More than 50% of their trade now has been de-dollarized. One thing we have to remember is that the Trump administration's dual policies, right, of sanctions on Russia and a trade war with China has pushed those two countries together. And they're also, both of them, exploring ways, and have been, or the Russians certainly since 2014, of moving away from an international payment system that's based on the SWIFT system. One of the so-called nuclear options from the point of view of the US was to throw Russia out of that, of course, which hasn't happened. Well, they're looking at it the other way and saying, how can we avoid this? And there are still already some ways that they're managing to avoid some of these financial sanctions. So, but nevertheless, their trade, it's now grown to, I think, $100 billion. It's still much smaller, overwhelmingly than US-Chinese trade. I don't know where it will come out after all of the trade wars, but still, China is much more important economically I mean, the US is much more important economically to China than Russia is. The military partnership, again, it's a very instrumental thing. The Chinese haven't had nearly as much experience as the Russians have in deploying and using their military. And so that's one of the things that certainly they learned from in these joint maneuvers in the Vostok, the Eastern military maneuvers last year. But what's interesting is they've now agreed that they're going to sign a new military cooperation agreement. And I think when we know the terms of that, if we know them, because some of it could not be made public, I think people think there's going to be closer military cooperation. Another big question is, we know that Russia and China are the major cyber threats to the US. How much are they cooperating with this? I know this is something that people are watching. I think for the lay people, it's harder to estimate that, but I think that's something to certainly ask about. So in many ways, there are all these asymmetries, and the Chinese will express astonishment that, not publicly, but that Russia hasn't modernized its economy more. And they don't really understand that, given all of Russia's, potential wealth and ability and scientific prowess too. But I think it's a mistake now to say, oh, it's just an axis of convenience, and to sort of belittle it, which a number of people in this town have done. Because I think it has moved to the level now of military and other kinds of cooperation, and I think a firm belief that they want to create a system which reduces particularly US influence in the world.
Let's turn to Europe. Now, you are a real expert in Europe, and there are so many things we could get into on that. But you mentioned Macron, and I have two quotes from him: time to ease tensions with Russia, and then Russia and Europe should be brought back together. Now, he pulled that back somewhat, but this is around the time of the recent G7 meeting in France, in fact, and yet he is saying something that has some people worried, because if you look at what Putin tries to do, a lot of his approach to Europe is dividing, trying to pull them from the United States, divide them among themselves. So what do you make of Macron's outreach, and yet there's a danger with him, with that approach, of really overstepping and saying, come on back, Mr. Putin, to the fold when there are no demands on Putin?
Yes, so first of all, Macron has seized on an opportunity that he sees, and that is the weakening of Merkel, the problems that Germany's having, and that Germany is no longer playing the kind of leadership role. I mean, until now, really the major European power, and the French have always chafed at this. Why are the Germans, why were they the major partner and not France? After all, we can go back to the Franco-Russian alliance of the 19th century. So he's trying to seize this opportunity. And then I think we also have a sort of phenomenon here that, and this is what the Russians, I think, count on. They annexed Crimea, they began this war in southeastern Ukraine, there was outrage, there were sanctions, but it's 5 years later and people want to move on. And they bank on the fact that the people in the West, and particularly look at all the problems the EU is having, the United States is having, that they're not paying attention to this anymore, and people will say, we have enough other problems, let's try and mend relations with Russia, sort of forgetting why they broke in the beginning. And you're right, there's been a lot of criticism in the French media, but also some praise for what he's doing. Now, you can also say that at that G7, you also had President Trump saying it's time, agreeing with him, it's time to bring Russia, back into the G7, et cetera. And there, even Macron was kind of, a little more cautious about that. So we'll see where that goes. They've now, I read the sort of communique of what they said after this Franco-Russian meeting today, we're going to begin to seek new ways of interacting with each other. It'll probably be just another cycle of, we're going to do a reset, and we'll get all happy about it in the beginning, and then by the end we'll be very frustrated. But Macron's obviously doing this for domestic political reasons too, and in terms of the European Union for his own leadership role.
And then you have those other countries in Europe, let's say Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban. The Italians, at one point, who espouse things that Putin likes. Nationalism, I mean, after all, Mr. Putin seems to say it's every country on its own. You have the right, just Russia has the right to define what it wants and don't bother interfering. Thank you very much. And so that jibes with what Viktor Orban would be saying. Traditional values, there are a lot of aspects of his policies that are things that Mr. Putin wants. So tell us, what is the Russian influence in countries like that that have more autocratic leaders that kind of remind people of Mr. Putin?
So, I mean, obviously, Russian influence is growing. The economic relationship between Russia and a number of these countries, including Hungary, has really grown. It's not only energy, it's trade, it's Russia building nuclear power plants, economic interconnections. And don't forget that some of these, economic ties, intelligence ties, things like that, they've just lasted since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Those networks were there before, and they can just, be reactivated, let's say, when they need to be. Russia, and, the Russians are popular in as much as Putin puts himself forward in many ways as a populist hero, right? As an advocate of populist policies. I've heard him at one of these Valdai conference, I don't know if you were that one, saying, the elites are not serving their populations in the West. The elites are bad. I'm for the people. And so the sort of populist appeal, appealing to extreme right and left-wing groups too. Sovereignty, right? One of Putin's hallmarks is the absolute sovereignty for large countries, limited sovereignty for smaller ones, but sovereignty, each country's sovereignty. What does Viktor Orban hate? People like Orban and other, Poland as well, although Poland's the exception because it isn't moving closer to Russia. They hate Brussels telling them what to do, right? And so, someone like Orban doesn't like Brussels telling him that he's illiberal, that he doesn't have the rule of law. He wants the sovereignty, and that's something where Putin will say, fine, we're all sovereign, we're not going to tell you what to do. So there are a number of ways, and then I think in the Hungarian case, there are probably all kinds of business ties now with Russia that maybe, are not obvious, but exist.
Yes, in fact, Angela and I have talked about this many times, that, you can take over countries in different ways, and economics is one way that, Russia certainly has influenced and begun to control certain countries economically by buying companies, Russian business people buying companies, and then eventually corruption seeps in, and then people who are in the parliament are bribed, and then policies are passed that are good for Russia. It's a kind of a vicious system. But let me very quickly, because I want to make sure people have time to ask questions, but I cannot avoid the election.
Right.
Okay, the elections that just took place on Sunday, you had Moscow city government, and many other places around the country. But Moscow city government, the systemic opposition, as it's called, and you could say Mr. Navalny, let's say the genius in social media, who brought together what he has been urging people to vote against the government. Then he came out with this phrase, smart voting. And this was allying all of the different groups, including communists, just to say anybody but the ruling party. And they won 20 out of 45 seats in the Moscow city government. Those results just came out today. So quite impressive. So what's your interpretation? How worried should the Kremlin be? St. Petersburg was, I should say, St. Petersburg was different because after all, they pulled out all the stops and had a government win. But tell us your interpretation, and especially what the Kremlin is thinking at this point about those elections.
Right, so it may seem odd that these were municipal elections in Moscow for the city council. What are you discussing? refuse collection, taxi licensing, things like that. But they've become very important because it was one way for opposition people to try and get on the ballot, and for which you have to have 5,000 signatures, and then all of their claims, except for one candidate, were denied. Now, in Moscow, you know what that meant, right? The systemic opposition. Lots of communists are now on the city council. And in the regions, the gubernatorial elections, I think the Kremlin couldn't be too unhappy, with the exception of Khabarovsk in the Far East, where the LDPR, the misnamed Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which is in fact an extreme right-wing party, they won not only the governorship, but most of the seats. So it's a very mixed picture. And yet the LDPR is one of the, 4 sanctioned parties in Russia, so even though they're not United Russia. So I think the lesson that the Kremlin will draw from that is, you have to be worried about Moscow, but that's been evident for some time. In the last presidential election, even those figures weren't public, apparently a minority of people in Moscow voted for Putin in the last presidential election. And yet most of the revolutions and changes in government happen in Moscow. So I think from the Kremlin's point of view, you have to worry about what's happening in Moscow. We'll see what happens with these 20 systemic opposition people being on the local council and what an impact that has. And then I think we have to see, are these demonstrations going to go away? Are people still going to come out in the streets? Or now that the elections are over, will they bide their time? How are they going to mobilize people? And what they did do with these demonstrators was to use quite a lot of force, excessive force against some of these demonstrators, jailing them, then releasing them. So I think they have to be somewhat worried, but maybe not as worried as we thought they might have to be.
Then my last question will be very similar to that. Putin specifically, Putin personally, how politically secure is he at this moment?
So that's a question, of course, about which there is a lot of debate. I think from the outside, it would be very hard to say that he isn't secure. The public opinion polls are contradictory, right? His popularity is still 68%, which, most Western politicians would die for. And those are polls that are done by the Levada organization, which is really the last remaining independent organization, even though they say maybe you can't believe all those numbers. On the other hand, when it comes to, do you think he should run again, or how much do you trust him, the figures are a little bit more contradictory. He appears to be, at the moment, quite secure. People are grumbling a lot about the economy. That's the other thing. The Levada polls show that a majority of Russians favor change over stability. And that's different from a few years ago when they valued the stability they have. The fact that he's raised the retirement age, that there hasn't been the kind of pension reform that people had hoped for. There's a lot of, people's standard of living is not as good as it was before. The economy is still growing, but maybe by 1.1%. So the economic growth is sluggish. So and Russians, there was an article in the FT recently about how much they've gone into debt. So there's economic grumbling. But on the other hand, there's no national opposition leader. Navalny is liked by some, but is not a national leader, and there's no one else. There's also a nationalist opposition, which we don't talk about, that thinks Putin and his people aren't tough enough. So I think right now he looks pretty secure, but the thing when you've studied Russia long enough as we have, you can be surprised, and everything is predictable until it's not predictable the next day.
Well, on that note, I think we'll open it up to questions, and I know we have some microphones floating around. There we go. So happy to take your questions. If you would please, number one, ask a question as opposed to a statement. And if you would introduce yourself just so we know who you are. And sir, we can begin over there with you.
Hi, my name is Richard Pearson. What is likely to happen with Georgia? We don't hear much about it. The Russians extended their sphere of influence a number of years ago. Is that likely to change? Are they happy with the status quo, or what?
So Russians, the Russians use the frozen conflicts as a way of making the central government in the country in which there's a frozen conflict, making it much harder for them to govern. So yes, Russia occupies two areas of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Even though it doesn't completely control the people who are in power there, it obviously has very close relations with them and supports them financially. So is there any prospect of those areas returning to the control of Tbilisi in the near future? No, I don't think so. Georgia, finds itself in a very difficult position, given its location. When its relationship with Russia, is very bad as it was after the 2008 war and at various other times, there are economic boycotts. Remittances are still very important. There are a lot of Georgians that work in Russia and they send their remittances back home. And without those remittances, it's harder both for their families to function, but also for the general economy. So it's in Georgia's interest to have less confrontational relations with Russia, also from a sort of economic point of view. And you have a government in Georgia now that is trying to balance the two. Georgia has aspirations to join the European Union and NATO, but those are just aspirations. I mean, there's very little possibility that either of those things in the foreseeable future would happen. I think the Georgians worry that the Russians might try and take more territory. Occasionally they try and move the border, but it seems to be a stalemate at the moment. And as in so many of these countries in the post-Soviet space, a major challenge is for the Georgians themselves to deal with their own problems, economic problems, the problems of corruption, the problems of creating institutions which, mean that the country is better functioning, and they're still getting quite a lot of assistance from the Europeans and from the United States.
Sir? There we go.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and my question is about the relationship between China and Russia. What do you see as far as cooperation between the militaries for advancement as far as technologies? You hear about the advanced planes and ships that Russia's doing, but yet it's still leaving many of them on the bottom of the ocean. The Chinese are trying to protect the South China Sea and improve their military. So what collaboration and cooperation do you see between the militaries that have real implications for the Far East? Thank you for being here.
Thank you for your question. So obviously the Chinese have bought a lot of Russian military hardware, and gradually the Russians have been willing to sell the Chinese more of their more advanced military hardware. In the beginning, they were very wary. And what was happening is that the Chinese were buying advanced Russian military hardware and then reverse engineering it, and that the Russians didn't really want that either. But as I say, as Russia's relationship with the West has deteriorated, it's been willing to sell more to the Chinese. So that cooperation is certainly going on. As I mentioned before, apparently the Russians and Chinese are about to sign they've announced they're going to sign a new military cooperation agreement. I think when that's signed, and if we find out what's in it, that might give us some more clues. As far as the South China Sea is concerned, the Russians stay out of it. They haven't criticized the Chinese, they don't comment on it, just as the Chinese don't, at least officially, ever talk about what Russia's doing in Ukraine, although the Chinese themselves are quite economically involved with Ukraine, but they don't criticize what Russia's doing. They never criticize anything Russia does publicly. So I would assume that the military cooperation, military hardware will continue, but there's also a wariness. I think it'll be interesting to see. I mean, one of the reasons the US says it pulled out of the INF agreement is because the Chinese are building up their intermediate range nuclear missile force. They don't have that many, strategic nuclear weapons, it's much smaller. And they're trying to get the Chinese involved in discussions of a follow-on treaty to the INF, if there ever is such a thing, or even to the New START. And the Russians have said that they think the Chinese should be involved in that too. The Chinese, of course, have said adamantly against that and said it's got nothing to do with us. We have a minuscule number of nuclear weapons. You two have most of them. Leave us out of this. But the Russians might have to, faced with a Chinese intermediate range nuclear missile buildup on their own territory, the Russians might have to respond to that, even though officially you're never going to see that in the Russian military doctrine. So I think the next thing to watch is, as I say, what's happening with this renewed military cooperation agreement.
More questions? There's a woman here.
Hi, I'm Margie Lerman. The question is, what leadership is on the horizon? Who after Putin? Is anyone being groomed? Is anyone notable that we should be keeping an eye on?
That's a great question, so I'll quote Lev Pavlovsky, who used to work for Putin and doesn't anymore. Those who know don't talk, and those who talk don't know. There are always rumors. The mayor of Moscow was rumored, possibly Sergei Sobyanin. Then people said, well, maybe all of the demonstrations in Moscow, and that had to do, and the way they responded to them had to do with infighting there. Occasionally, they will mention different regional governors. Putin has put in power a number of younger men, in their 40s and 50s, as regional governors. Could one of them be being groomed? If they are, it sure is hidden from the rest of us. And I'm not sure that Putin himself knows that. Most Russians I know don't believe that Putin will leave power in 2024. He'll find some way of staying in power. He might not be the president anymore, but he'll have another role, in which case he'll postpone that transition to power. Then there's always Dmitry Medvedev, who you may recall was president for 4 years, and now has been prime minister for the rest of them, if there was some other power sharing agreement. So the answer is, I really have no idea, and I'm not sure who does. Do you, Jill?
I certainly do not. And I think one of his problems is if he says, well, I have somebody waiting in the wings, he is a lame duck, So it's and if you're a lame duck in Russia, you're really lame. Lady right there, please.
Thank you, Professor Joyce Mushaben in transition. You brought in the term corruption, because if there's one thing that China and Russia have in common, it's a lot of corruption, but China's positive economic growth rate gives it a little bit more wiggle room. Where, if anywhere, do you see potential for economic recovery and growth in Russia? Renewable energies in Europe are going to start chipping away at that base. The trade relations are not as intense. Do you see some positive signs of him being able to turn, or anybody being able to turn that economy around?
Well, they can only do it if they introduce far-reaching structural reforms. I mean, when was the last time you went to a store in the United States and bought something that was made in Russia, as opposed to being made in China, which nearly everything is made? So Russia really, it exports oil and gas and military hardware. It doesn't produce manufactured goods that most other people want to buy. So what they have to do is to introduce modernizing reforms, but they've resisted doing it. I mean, historically, every time a leader, be it under the Tsars or the Soviets or now Russia, post-Soviet Russia, have started to introduce economic reforms, they then moved back, either because they thought they were politically too dangerous, or in the case, I think, of Putin and the people around him, because it would threaten their vested interests, coming back to people who've made an enormous amounts of money on oil and gas. There are younger people. There are people like Alexei Kudrin, the former finance minister, who's still around, who keeps urging. There are those economists around Putin who say, we have to change this, we have to have structural reforms, we have to move away from this dependence on oil and gas. They could do it, and then presumably, and again, they have great scientific prowess, they have, their math teaching is probably better than it is in this country, all of that, they have the brains there, but they have to have a system where innovation thrives. And they don't. They tried to create an innovation village called Skolkovo outside of Moscow in cooperation with MIT and Stanford and other places. But the problem is you can't introduce innovation from above. If you want innovation to work, you have to have it from below. A lot of the money that was invested in that Skolkovo project disappeared, and it still hasn't produced the innovation. So they have to change the system, and so far they haven't been willing to do it.
And I guess this is the corner where the questions are coming from. Very fertile area. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sherry Grossman, retired from USAID. My agency spent about 20 years working with reformers to sow the seeds of democratic institutions, and I'm wondering, given your reading of history, whether that was for naught, or do you see?
Well, I certainly wouldn't say that what USAID was for naught. I just think that, maybe we just didn't understand enough in the 1990s how complicated a lot of this was. I think obviously some of the money that was given, was sidelined, went into for purposes that maybe it wasn't meant. I think we maybe underestimated the degree to which Russians felt humiliated by the idea of the United States coming in and telling them what to do, giving them assistance, which was very generous of us, but I think they chafed at it. Could that have been done differently? Maybe. I think now in retrospect they will certainly give you that narrative. And, I think, we are not responsible for the fact that this corrupt system of crony capitalism developed there, because I think some of it we didn't see going, it was happening out of our purview. But probably we probably underestimated the complexity, or we assumed that because they had thrown off the shackles of this very strange socialist economic system, that they would want to embrace the kind of free market system that we have, and that's not what happened. And maybe we also didn't focus enough on the people. What had happened in the Soviet era, there was a thriving underground economy, right? People made lots of money. I mean, they were capitalists underground in an allegedly nominally socialist system. And for those people playing by the rules of the game, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that really wasn't in their modus operandi.
Questions? Okay. This gentleman right here, and then the lady there.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz. And I was wondering, I've heard that a lot of North Korea's missile technology came from Russia. I'm wondering, what is Putin's involvement, if any, in North Korea's policies and strategies?
So, I mean, I think certainly some of the nuclear technology we hear also came from Ukraine. Maybe not officially. So yeah, but then we mustn't forget A.Q. Khan. So I really do think that this began the North Korean nuclear program with the Pakistani nuclear scientist who was then selling this to all kinds of countries. So I think he bears more of a responsibility for this than either in the Soviet or the post-Soviet era. North Korea and Russia do have an economic relationship. There are a significant number of North Korean laborers in Russia, particularly in the Russian Far East. And Russia, as far as I understand, hasn't complied with the sanctions which say that most of these people should be returned. So they have North Korean labor there. We also know there have been some evidence that the North Koreans have avoided some of the sanctions by sending their ships with, exports to Russia, and then they changed ships, and they've managed to evade some of the sanctions. Russia isn't the major player with North Korea. It's clearly China in terms of political solutions. But we did finally have a meeting between Putin and Kim Jong-un, and I think Russia would like to be more of a player. But I'm not sure that we're aware of the full extent of how much Russia has been involved in North Korea's nuclear program, or at least that's not public knowledge.
And there was yes.
Hi, Katie Gribble. Thank you again for coming tonight. You touched on some of the Moscow narratives and foreign policy objectives on those countries in Europe and Asia. I'm kind of curious about those countries closer to home here, more broadly Latin America and specifically Venezuela, and what you think their intentions there.
So, when Hugo Chavez came to power, and the relationship with the United States soured, and then he didn't really know how to run the oil economy, the energy economy very well. So that's when the Russians really stepped in, was under Chavez to sort of prop up the Venezuelan oil economy. And the man who really has the portfolio for Venezuela is Igor Sechin. He's the head of Rosneft, Russia's largest oil company, a very close pal, an associate, let's say, of Vladimir Putin. And so there's yet the Russians have also been aware of, the fact that under Chavez and now obviously under Maduro, the economy is kind of run into the ground. So they're still very much involved in the oil industry. They've lent Venezuela money. They are somewhat involved in the security apparatus, although obviously the Cubans are the key players there, and also somewhat involved with the Venezuelan military. We know that there were stories a couple of months ago of a plane landing with Russian military personnel there. They're obviously advising the military. So there's an involvement there, and I think it's also, one of the things that Putin's Russia is very good at doing is sort of acting as a spoiler and making it harder for the United States or its allies to implement or fulfill the policies that they want to do. And obviously what they're doing in Venezuela has added to the complications from the US point of view of trying to get a different government in power, although I would say, again, Cuba is the major player there. But they certainly have energy and economic interests there.
I just wanted to, we'll get to them in 2 seconds, but I think that's a really important point about this being the spoiler, because I think there's an image in the United States of Putin as a malevolent force who has it all gamed out in advance, and he's very smart, and he can, control all of the world. Whereas actually, you pointed out very importantly that he takes advantage of the weaknesses, the failings, the lack of action on the United States or the west side, the west part, and exploits it, and then deftly uses it to his own purposes. And so that idea of him as a real actor, many times he's really a reactor more than an actor.
Yeah, and I mean, Venezuela was a great opportunity for Russia, again, when Chavez was in power. And of course, if you talk to Russians, they say, well, you have a Monroe Doctrine. And when you say, well, the Monroe Doctrine isn't quite working the way it used to work, I think the viewpoint in Russia is also, we're interfering in their backyard, exhibit number 1 and 2, Georgia and Ukraine, and therefore they're interfering in our backyard, and it's fair game.
Here we go. And the woman who's right here, please. In blue. Yes, please, in turquoise.
Hi, my name is Sarah Diligenti. I'm the executive director of the Alliance Française in Washington, D.C., but I'm not going to ask you anything about Russia and France, actually. First, 2 questions. First is domestic Russia. What do you think is the importance of the climate change in Russia, especially in Siberia? This morning in the Siberian Times, they talked about the Lena, which was so shallow that the boats couldn't go to Yakutia, which is the most important diamond center for the economy of Russia. So how is it going to affect the Russian economy in the future? Was it positively or negatively, the climate change, the permafrost thawing? My second question is regarding the Middle East. Since Russia seems to have relations with all of the Finns and foes in the Middle East, would it be possible, in as much as it is always unpredictable with Russians, to actually Vladimir Putin finding himself by chance as a major actor towards a peace plan in the Middle East?
Okay, those are 2 big questions. So Vladimir Putin used to say, it's good if it's 2 degrees warmer in Russia because we can grow more. Climate change is good. It's a pretty cold country. He has, I think, somewhat tempered that. So about 10 years ago, there was a major report, an unclassified report from the National Intelligence Council called, it's maybe 15 years ago now, The Impact of Climate Change on Russia. And as I say, it's 15 years ago, so things have changed. But if you look at climate change has a different impact in different parts of Russia. It's the largest country in the world, right? It's had such different topography that for some areas, actually, it's good. They can grow more. But obviously, in the Russian Far East, with the melting of the permafrost, things are getting much worse. And it's not only inaccessible rivers, it's mud throughout. I mean, a couple of years ago in Yakutia, it was just, trucks and cars. The roads were impassable because of all the mud, because of and it's also affected the pipelines and things like that. So I think more Russian officials are taking this more seriously now, climate change, and they are working, or there's certainly Russian scientists that are working with Western scientists on this issue. But on the other hand, in the Arctic, Russia now will have access to all kinds of raw materials that it didn't have access to before, and to shipping routes, as we know. So the whole nature of Russian activity in the Arctic and the great power competition in the Arctic has been quite drastically changed by by what's happening there. But I think in general, the Russian government hasn't completely woken up to all of the implications of climate change, and particularly since it varies so much across the country. So could Russia be a force for peace in the Middle East? I don't know. I mean, if we're talking about which peace, right? I mean, the Syrian civil war is probably coming to an end. Russia will then, Russia and Iran will be the two predominant great, powers. I wouldn't call Iran a great power, but powers dealing with the Syrians. And it'll be very interesting to see there how Russia and Iran get on in the longer run. Are their interests similar in Syria? Could Russia be a force in terms of Arab-Israeli peace negotiations? Possibly. I mean, the Russians, they're a member of the quartet, but that's, hasn't been doing very much. So far, the Russians have not wanted to put themselves forward that much, although it's true that under Gorbachev, there was a major Middle East conference where this is the very end of Gorbachev's time in office, where Russia tried to play that role. It's possible that it could, but so far one hasn't seen it trying to do that.
We have time for a couple more questions. Sir, right there. Yes.
Ian Freed here. For someone who preaches sovereignty so much, Putin seems real hell-bent on affecting our elections here. And I'm curious, one, what is his motivation and endgame for that? And two, how useful is Trump or has Trump been for Putin? Or how does he view Trump?
Those are great questions. Does Putin have buyer's remorse for what happened in 2016? So I think the motivation certainly, if you go back to 2016 or you start in 2014, I mean, it's all in the Mueller report. So I think Putin genuinely believes that in 2011, when there were these huge demonstrations against him in Moscow, and he blamed Hillary Clinton for paying the demonstrators to go into the streets, I think on some level he really believes that the United States, the State Department, or whatever, was responsible for egging on and supporting whatever demonstrators against him. So he thought it's fair game. If the US can do this to us, we can do this to them. And of course, it's happened in the past. This is not the first time either side has tried to do this. So I think their motivation was really in 2016, on the one hand, to say, you Americans keep telling us we're not democratic and you have this great system, look at you. And therefore, you mobilize people on Facebook to fight each other, Black Lives Matter and white supremacists to come together and all of that to reinforce the chaos and the polarization here, and to make Americans more uncertain about, is our system working or not? And then I think another part of it, and that became clear in 2016, obviously, was you had a presidential candidate who said, I don't understand why we can't get along with Russia. Why can't we have better relations? I'm going to make a deal with President Putin. Everything's going to be fine. So if you have a candidate who's saying that, why not do whatever you could, to support him? And therefore, you then come to the Wikileaks and the leaking of the emails and all of those kinds of things. So how do they assess what's happened? Well, obviously, they must be a little bit disappointed because they didn't anticipate the impact that the knowledge of their interference would have on Trump's inability to do things. He's been completely hamstrung in his ability. No doubt he would have reached out to Russia. He might have said, okay, Crimea is Russian. I mean, he said that during the election campaign, right? Let's do a deal. But he hasn't been able to do that because the Congress has stepped in and because the members of his executive branch have tried to restrain this. So the Russians may still have hope that if he's reelected, he could do things differently. I'm not sure. On the other hand, I think they also realize that, it's a little unpredictable, but I think that could still be, if there's going to be a motivation in 2020, it'll be partly the same thing. We're a polarized society, and you can take advantage of that, and you can make people unsure of the value of their own government and make them more malleable. But it could also be that they believe that if President Trump were to win a second term, he might be less hamstrung. But having said that, as long as the sanctions are on the books, there's not too much you can do. Economic sanctions, So he's actually pretty restricted in what he can do.
How are we doing? Are we almost out of time? One more question? Okay, thank you. Microphone is coming. There we go.
Thank you very much, Ann Pincus. My question has to do with was prompted by the murder of the Chechen leader in Berlin. And apropos of that, I keep thinking, who is around Putin that has real influence? I mean, are there any people who are influencing him on that direction, or is he calling all the shots? Thank you.
So again, we get back to the people who know, don't talk, talk, don't know. I mean, there are, as far as we understand it, there are people with whom he consults on these issues. It's a small group of people. It's not always the same people. It depends on the issue. So that's one answer to your question. The other answer is, you know, and you go back to the Skripal poisoning, for instance, or maybe this assassination too. You can say that there is a general understanding among certain people in Russia, maybe certain people in certain branches of security services, whatever, that it's okay to do certain things. That doesn't mean that Putin picks up the phone and tells people what to do, or specifically calls the shots and everything. He's not all powerful. I mean, there are people around him who have their own interests. And so you have to understand it more as a system where there are different individuals who believe that if certain things are done, there's not going to be any retribution for it, and it's going to be accepted by the leadership. And I think that's probably the best that one can say in answer to that question.
Okay, well, we are now out of time. And I do want to correct one thing that you said, because you said, quoting a certain person, that people who don't know, or people who know don't talk, but you know, and you talked. And we are very grateful. Really, it was wonderful, because I was thinking, again, this encyclopedic knowledge that you obviously displayed. It was great, but you make it very understandable and really fascinating. And this is, after all, the country that we will be dealing with for a long time in the future. So I'd like to thank you very much, Angela. This is wonderful.